The Battle of Saipan, fought from June 15 to July 9, 1944, represented a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands, lay just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, close enough for the new B-29 Super Fortress bombers to strike the Japanese home islands. American strategists understood that capturing the Marianas would sever Japan's communication lines to the resource-rich southern territories and provide the bases needed for a strategic bombing campaign that could bring Japan to its knees. The Japanese understood this too, which is why they garrisoned Saipan with over 30,000 troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor. The American assault force was massive, the V Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions plus the 27th Infantry Division, over 71,000 troops supported by hundreds of ships and aircraft. The battle that followed was among the bloodiest in the Pacific, characterized by fierce Japanese resistance, desperate banzai charges, and tragic civilian mass suicides.
By early July 1944, American forces had pushed Japanese defenders into Saipan's mountainous northern interior. On July 7, in one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, many armed only with bamboo spears or improvised weapons, hurled themselves at American lines in a desperate final assault. The attack was suicidal and futile, breaking against American firepower and resulting in near-total Japanese casualties. Following this disaster, General Saito committed ritual suicide, seppuku, in his command cave, and Admiral Nagumo shot himself. Organized resistance collapsed. Over the following days, hundreds of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them, jumped from cliffs at Marapi Point and Banzai Cliff in horrific scenes that traumatized American witnesses who tried unsuccessfully to prevent the suicides. By July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. American casualties numbered approximately 3,400 killed and 13,000 wounded. Japanese military casualties exceeded 24,000 killed, with fewer than 2,000 taken prisoner. Additionally, thousands of Japanese and Korean civilians died. Yet Saipan was not truly secure. Scattered throughout the island's rugged northern mountains and dense jungle were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Japanese soldiers who had refused to participate in the final banzai charge or who had become separated from their units during the chaotic final days. Some were wounded, some were simply lost, and some had consciously chosen to continue fighting rather than die in a futile charge or commit suicide. Among these holdouts was Captain Sakae Oba, a 27-year-old infantry officer who would transform from a conventional military commander into a guerrilla leader of remarkable skill and determination. Oba commanded approximately 200 men from various units, survivors of the 136th Infantry Regiment, naval personnel, labor troops, along with roughly 200 civilians, many of them Korean laborers and Japanese settlers. Rather than accepting death as inevitable, Oba made a radical decision. His people would survive. They would live in the mountains, conduct guerrilla operations against American forces, grow food, maintain discipline, and wait for relief, for rescue, for something that might change their desperate situation.
Sakae Oba was born in 1914 in Osaka Prefecture, Japan, into a middle-class family during the Taisho era. He attended military preparatory schools and entered the Imperial Japanese Army as an officer candidate, receiving his commission in the late 1930s. Unlike many of his contemporaries who embraced the militaristic fervor and death-before-dishonor ethos that characterized much of the Japanese military,
Oba was known as a thoughtful, pragmatic officer who prioritized his men's welfare and demonstrated tactical flexibility unusual in an army that often favored rigid doctrine. He had served in Manchuria and China before being assigned to the 136th Infantry Regiment, which deployed to Saipan in early 1944 as part of the island's reinforced garrison. Oba's personality combined traditional Japanese military discipline with an adaptability that would prove crucial for survival. He respected authority and martial values, but wasn't willing to throw away lives unnecessarily. When the Battle of Saipan began on June 15th, Oba's unit was positioned in the island's interior, tasked with defending against the expected American advance. Oba fought conventional defensive actions for 3 weeks as American forces systematically destroyed Japanese defensive positions. He watched his regiment shattered by American firepower, naval gunfire, artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, and aircraft that dominated the battlefield. By early July, Oba commanded perhaps 200 men, a fraction of his original force, and was receiving fragmentary, often contradictory orders from higher headquarters that was itself disintegrating under American pressure. When word came of the planned final Banzai charge on July 7th, Oba faced a critical decision. Military duty and Bushido tradition demanded he lead his men in the charge, accepting death as the proper conclusion to a lost battle. But Oba looked at his exhausted, starving soldiers and the terrified civilians who had attached themselves to his unit and made a different choice.
Oba gathered his officers and non-commissioned officers on the evening of July 6, 1944, and laid out his plan. They would not participate in the suicidal Banzai charge. Instead, they would withdraw deeper into Saipan's mountainous northern jungle, establish hidden camps, conduct guerrilla operations to harass American forces and obtain supplies, and survive until— Oba didn't specify until what, because he didn't know. Perhaps until Japan won the war through some miracle. Perhaps until reinforcements arrived. Perhaps simply until surviving became impossible. What mattered was that they would live, maintain discipline, protect the civilians, and continue the fight on their own terms. This decision was revolutionary and risky. By refusing to participate in the final charge, Oba risked being labeled a coward or traitor. His men could refuse to follow him and report his desertion to higher command. The civilians might panic without military leadership willing to die gloriously. But Oba's personality and reputation carried the day. His men trusted him, recognized the futility of the Banzai charge, and chose life over death.
On July 7, while thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians charged to their deaths or leapt from cliffs, Oba led his group, now numbering approximately 200 soldiers and 200 civilians, deeper into the mountainous jungle of northern Saipan. The terrain was rugged, steep limestone ridges, dense tropical vegetation, numerous caves, and stream-cut valleys that were nearly impassable. This harsh landscape, which had complicated American military operations, would become Oba's fortress. He established a main camp in a remote valley, accessible only through narrow, easily defended approaches, with caves providing shelter and concealment from American aerial observation. Oba organized his followers with military precision. Soldiers were divided into squads, responsible for security, foraging, raiding, and camp maintenance. Civilians were assigned roles, growing food, preparing meals, caring for wounded, and maintaining the camps.
Oba's first priority was food. The group had minimal supplies, whatever they carried into the jungle, plus some cached stores. Oba organized foraging parties to gather wild plants, catch fish from streams, and hunt for whatever game existed on the island. More importantly, he ordered cultivation of small hidden gardens where they could grow sweet potatoes, vegetables, and other crops. These gardens were carefully concealed under jungle canopy and camouflage, invisible from the air, and positioned far from American traveled areas. Oba also instituted strict rationing, ensuring that food was distributed fairly and that enough was preserved for emergencies. Water came from mountain streams, carefully tested to avoid American positions upstream. Medical care was primitive. They had a few medical personnel but almost no supplies. Wounds were treated with improvised bandages, infections fought with jungle plants that might have antibiotic properties, and the seriously injured often simply died despite all efforts.
Discipline was crucial. Oba maintained military structure and routine despite their desperate circumstances. Each morning began with assembly, where Oba would address his people, reinforce group cohesion, and maintain the fiction that they were still part of the Imperial Japanese Army, waiting for orders or relief. Soldiers stood guard in shifts, maintained their weapons, though ammunition was precious and conserved, and conducted regular patrols. Civilians were treated respectfully, but expected to contribute. Oba dealt harshly with anyone who threatened group cohesion. Theft of food, attempted desertion, or insubordination resulted in punishment. This rigid structure prevented the group from degenerating into chaos and gave everyone purpose and hope. Oba also maintained a calendar, meticulously tracking days, which helped preserve sanity and temporal awareness in the timeless jungle environment.
Oba earned his nickname the Fox through cunning guerrilla tactics that frustrated American forces for over a year. Unlike holdouts who simply hid or launched futile attacks, Oba conducted carefully planned raids designed to obtain supplies, gather intelligence, and demonstrate continued resistance while minimizing casualties. His typical raid followed a pattern. Small teams of 3 to 5 soldiers would observe American positions for days, learning routines and identifying vulnerable targets. Raids occurred at night or dawn when American vigilance was lowest. Targets were usually supply dumps, isolated outposts, or vehicle parks, places where Oba's men could grab supplies and disappear before American reaction forces arrived. The raiders took food, medicine, clothing, and occasionally weapons and ammunition, then melted back into the jungle using pre-planned escape routes. Oba's guerrilla campaign embarrassed American commanders who had declared Saipan secure. Each raid demonstrated that Japanese forces remained active, undermining the official narrative and requiring American forces to maintain security patrols and guard details that could have been deployed elsewhere. U.S. forces launched repeated sweeps into northern Saipan, using infantry patrols, tracker dogs, and even aerial reconnaissance to locate Oba's camps. But Oba proved remarkably elusive. His scouts monitored American movements, and when sweeps approached his camps, Oba would evacuate hours before American arrival, moving his entire group, soldiers and civilians, to alternate camps prepared for such contingencies. This mobility, combined with the difficult terrain and Oba's intimate knowledge of northern Saipan's geography, allowed him to evade capture repeatedly. American forces employed various tactics to root out holdouts. They broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese from loudspeakers, dropped leaflets promising humane treatment, and employed Japanese-American interpreters and POWs to negotiate. But Oba didn't trust these messages. He assumed they were tricks, and Japanese propaganda had convinced him that Americans tortured prisoners. American forces also tried starvation tactics, attempting to destroy Oba's hidden gardens and contaminate water sources. When these methods failed, they resorted to firepower, shelling suspected camp areas with artillery and mortars. Yet Oba's camps were usually empty when shells arrived, his intelligence network having warned him of impending bombardments. This cat-and-mouse game continued month after month, with Oba demonstrating tactical skill that earned grudging respect even from his American adversaries. Life in Oba's hidden camps was harsh but structured.
Days began at dawn with assembly and inspection. Oba would address his people, provide updates, often fabricated to maintain morale, and assign daily tasks. Soldiers rotated between guard duty, patrol, foraging, and rest. Those not on duty maintained equipment, repaired clothing and shelters, or helped with food preparation. The civilians, many of them Korean laborers who had been working on Saipan's defenses, grew vegetables in hidden gardens, prepared meals, cared for children, and maintained camp areas. Despite severe shortages, Oba enforced standards of cleanliness and order, understanding that maintaining routine prevented despair and chaos.
Food was the constant obsession. The hidden gardens produced sweet potatoes, taro, and vegetables, but yields were insufficient for 400 people. Foraging parties supplemented with jungle plants, though many tropical plants were inedible or toxic, requiring careful identification. Protein was scarce. Occasional fish from streams, land crabs, insects, and very rarely wild birds. Hunger was constant, with most people existing on 500 to 800 calories daily. Starvation rations that left everyone gaunt and weak. Children suffered particularly, and several infants born in the camps died from malnutrition and lack of medical care. Oba prioritized feeding soldiers who conducted raids and guard duty, reasoning that they needed strength to function, but he enforced strict rationing to prevent favoritism accusations. Water was generally adequate from mountain streams, though during dry periods it became scarce.
Medical care was desperate. The group had perhaps 2 medics and virtually no supplies. Wounds were cleaned with boiled water and dressed with cloth torn from clothing. Infections, inevitable in the tropical environment, were often fatal. Several soldiers died from injuries sustained in falls or during raids. Disease was rampant. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers affected most people at various times. Without quinine or antibiotics, treatment consisted of rest, fluids, and hope. The medics attempted traditional remedies using jungle plants, with mixed results. Mental health deteriorated as months passed. Depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychotic breaks affected soldiers and civilians alike. Oba dealt with mental health crises through a combination of discipline, encouragement, and, when necessary, physical restraint of those who might endanger the group.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender to the nation, though few outside Japan heard the scratchy radio message clearly. American forces on Saipan certainly knew the war was over, and assumed remaining holdouts would soon surrender. But Oba heard nothing. His group had no radio capable of receiving broadcasts, and he was isolated from news. American loudspeaker broadcasts and leaflets announcing Japan's surrender began immediately, but Oba dismissed them as psychological warfare tricks. He had been told repeatedly that Americans would say anything to induce surrender, and the idea that Japan, undefeated in spirit, according to propaganda he'd internalized, had surrendered seemed impossible. Oba reasoned that if Japan had truly surrendered, proper notification would come through Japanese military channels, not enemy propaganda.
American efforts to convince Oba intensified after Japan's surrender. They employed Japanese POWs who had known Oba before the battle, hoping personal appeals would succeed where anonymous broadcasts failed. They dropped detailed surrender instructions and photographs of the surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri. They even brought Oba's family photographs, obtained through Japanese authorities, and letters from his relatives urging surrender. But Oba remained skeptical. How did he know these POWs weren't coerced? Photographs could be faked, letters could be forged. And if the war was truly over, why were Americans so desperate to capture him? To Oba, the American insistence suggested he was more important than he knew. Perhaps his resistance was tying down American forces needed elsewhere. Perhaps Japan was counting on him to maintain resistance. This paranoid reasoning, while objectively irrational, made sense within Oba's isolated worldview.
Throughout autumn 1945, Oba continued guerrilla operations, though the character of his raids changed. He now focused almost exclusively on obtaining food and medicine rather than harassing Americans. His people were starving and diseased, down to perhaps 46 soldiers and fewer than 150 civilians. Many had died or slipped away to surrender. Oba's own health deteriorated. He suffered from malaria, tropical ulcers, and malnutrition. Yet he maintained discipline and organization, believing his duty required continuing resistance until properly ordered to surrender by legitimate Japanese authority. The psychological burden was immense. Oba later admitted he had doubts about the war's status, but couldn't bring himself to surrender based on enemy propaganda. The shame of potential false surrender, being tricked into laying down arms while Japan still fought, seemed worse than continued suffering.
The breakthrough came through Lieutenant Sakae Oba, no relation, a Japanese officer who had been captured on Saipan, treated well by Americans, and agreed to help convince holdouts to surrender. Sakae Oba understood the psychology of Japanese officers like Sakae Oba: honor, duty, and the need for legitimate orders. In late November 1945, Sakae Oba, accompanied by American officers, began a careful campaign to reach Sakae Oba. Rather than demanding surrender, Sakae Oba left messages at locations where Sakae Oba's scouts would find them. The messages didn't claim Japan had surrendered. Instead, they stated that Imperial headquarters had ordered all Japanese forces to cease hostilities and that Emperor Hirohito himself commanded compliance. The messages included authenticating details, code words, references to shared experiences, information only a genuine Japanese officer would know.
Sakae Oba retrieved these messages and studied them carefully. The language, the military formality, the specific references, these seemed genuine, but he remained cautious. He sent his own messages back, asking questions only a genuine Japanese officer could answer, seeking confirmation of specific military details. This correspondence continued for days, with Sakae Oba patiently answering every query, providing every authentication Sakae Oba requested. Gradually, Sakae Oba's resistance weakened. The evidence was overwhelming. The war had indeed ended, Japan had surrendered, and the emperor himself commanded cessation of hostilities. But Sakae Oba needed one more thing. He needed to surrender honorably, not as defeated fugitives crawling from caves, but as soldiers laying down arms under proper military procedure.
On December 1, 1945, 512 days after Saipan was declared secure, Sakae Oba agreed to surrender. He negotiated the terms carefully. His soldiers would march out in formation, in uniform, however tattered, carrying their weapons but with bolts removed, and would formally surrender to American officers in a military ceremony that respected their service. The Americans agreed to these terms, recognizing that allowing an honorable surrender would end the holdout situation peacefully. Oba gathered his 46 remaining soldiers. The civilians had mostly slipped away to surrender separately in preceding weeks, and prepared them for what would be the hardest action of the war: walking out of the jungle not to fight or die, but to surrender.
On the morning of December 1, 1945, Captain Sakae Oba assembled his 46 soldiers for the last time. They stood in formation in a jungle clearing, wearing tattered uniforms, emaciated but standing straight, maintaining military bearing despite their condition. Oba addressed them briefly, explaining that they had fought honorably, survived against impossible odds, and would now surrender as commanded by their emperor. He reminded them they were still soldiers of Japan and would conduct themselves with dignity. Then, in formation, they began marching out of the jungle toward the designated meeting point with American forces. It took hours to reach the location, as the men were weak and the terrain difficult. But they marched in formation, maintaining discipline to the end.
The surrender ceremony was conducted with military formality. American officers, including the commanding general on Saipan, attended. Oba and his men marched into the designated area in formation, halted, and stood at attention. Oba stepped forward, saluted, and formally surrendered his sword, a symbol of officer status, to the senior American officer. His men then stacked their weapons in organized fashion. The Americans treated them with respect, no mockery, no humiliation. Medical personnel immediately began assessing the Japanese soldiers' health, and food was provided. Oba's men, many of whom hadn't seen adequate food in months, broke down crying at the sight of rice and vegetables. The Americans were shocked at the soldiers' condition, emaciated, disease-ridden, wearing rags, yet having maintained military organization until the end.
Following surrender, Oba and his men were taken to POW processing facilities on Saipan, where they received medical treatment, food, and rest. Oba cooperated fully with American authorities, providing information about his operations, though carefully avoiding anything that might endanger other holdouts elsewhere. He was treated as a POW under Geneva Convention rules and eventually repatriated to Japan in 1946. American officers who dealt with Oba expressed admiration for his tactical skill and leadership. He had conducted a remarkably effective guerrilla campaign with minimal resources, kept his people alive for 512 days, and maintained discipline until the end. Some Americans suggested Oba had fought longer than necessary, costing American lives and resources, but others recognized that, from his perspective, he had simply followed military duty until properly ordered to surrender.
In Japan, Oba's story became both celebrated and controversial. Some viewed him as a hero who had refused to surrender despite impossible odds, maintaining resistance when others gave up. Others saw him as a tragic figure, whose outdated sense of duty caused unnecessary suffering for his soldiers and civilians. Oba himself struggled with his wartime experiences. He had survived when so many died, had led people into prolonged suffering, and had surrendered when he'd spent his entire military life believing surrender was dishonorable. He wrote a memoir, Taiheiyo no Kiseki, Miracle in the Pacific, published in the 1960s, describing his experiences and attempting to explain his decisions. The book became a bestseller in Japan and was later adapted into films and documentaries. Oba returned to civilian life in Japan, working in various positions and occasionally speaking about his experiences. He maintained contact with some of his former soldiers, attending reunions and memorial services. Oba also corresponded with some American officers who had been involved in operations against him, developing a mutual respect based on shared military experience. In later years, Oba reflected that his greatest achievement wasn't the tactical success of his guerrilla campaign, but rather keeping most of his people alive when death would have been easier. He expressed regret for those who died under his command and questioned whether prolonging resistance after Japan's surrender had been justified. He died in 1992 at age 78, having outlived most of his wartime comrades. Oba's story represents an unusual chapter in Pacific War history. Most Japanese holdouts who continued fighting after their units were destroyed either died in futile attacks, committed suicide, or surrendered relatively quickly. The few who held out for extended periods, like Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda in the Philippines until 1974, or Sergeant Shuichi Yokoi in Guam until 1972, were individuals or very small groups. Oba commanded a substantial force and conducted organized military operations rather than simply hiding. His ability to keep 46 soldiers alive and organized for 512 days while conducting active guerrilla warfare was militarily significant and demonstrated exceptional leadership.
Military historians study Oba's tactics as examples of effective guerrilla warfare. His emphasis on intelligence gathering, careful raid planning, mobility, and resource management represents classic guerrilla doctrine. His ability to maintain discipline and organization while living in extremely harsh conditions demonstrates leadership principles applicable beyond military contexts. The American failure to eliminate Oba, despite enormous resource advantages, illustrates the difficulty of counter-guerrilla operations, a lesson that would prove relevant in later conflicts like Vietnam. Oba's story also challenges simplistic narratives about Japanese military fanaticism. While fanaticism certainly existed, Oba represented a more pragmatic strain of Japanese military thinking that prioritized survival and tactical flexibility over glorious death.
The story of Sakae Oba and the last battle of Saipan challenges us to look beyond simple narratives of heroism and fanaticism to understand the complex human realities of war. Oba was neither a mindless fanatic nor a war criminal. He was a capable officer who chose an unconventional path when conventional options meant death. His decision to prioritize survival over suicide, to conduct guerrilla warfare rather than futile banzai charges, represented a form of courage different from the stereotypical image of Japanese warriors seeking glorious death. Oba's 512-day resistance protected civilians who might have been forced into mass suicide, kept soldiers alive who would have died in the final charge, and demonstrated that even in Imperial Japan's rigid military culture, individual officers could make independent tactical decisions based on circumstances rather than doctrine.
Yet Oba's story also reminds us of war's human cost. The 46 soldiers who marched out of the jungle on December 1, 1945, had survived, but hundreds more died during the 512-day ordeal from disease, malnutrition, wounds, and despair. Civilians suffered terribly, caught between their loyalty to Japan and the reality of their situation. American soldiers died in operations against Oba's forces, and resources were diverted from other needs to deal with the holdout situation. We can admire Oba's tactical skill and leadership while acknowledging that war's continuation, even on a small scale, exacts terrible prices. As we remember the Pacific War's end, Oba's delayed surrender reminds us that wars don't end cleanly with signatures on documents. They end in jungle clearings and mountain caves, in the hearts and minds of soldiers who must decide when duty ends and survival begins, and in the difficult transition from warrior to veteran that every soldier must eventually make. Captain Sakae Oba, the Fox of Saipan, led 46 soldiers and 200 civilians through 512 days of guerrilla warfare after Saipan officially fell, demonstrating tactical brilliance, remarkable leadership, and a different kind of courage than the suicide charges that defined much of the Pacific War. His choice of life over death, survival over honor-suicide, challenges our understanding of Japanese military culture and reminds us that even in history's most rigid military systems, individual officers could choose humanity over doctrine. Oba's final surrender, conducted with military dignity on December 1, 1945, ended the last organized resistance on Saipan and closed a remarkable chapter of WW2 history. If this forgotten story fascinated you, please like this video and subscribe for more untold tales from WW2 and WW1. Next time, we'll explore another remarkable story of survival and courage, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, where Polish resistance fighters held out for 63 days against overwhelming German forces in history's largest urban resistance battle. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. Let's close with a Japanese proverb that seems fitting for Sakae Oba's story. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. Oba and his soldiers fell repeatedly into hardship, hunger, and despair, but stood up each time until they could finally lay down their weapons with honor. We remember their resilience and the complicated courage of all who fought in the Pacific War.